Motion for debate, report of the Built Environment Committee, the impact of environmental regulations on development. Lord Moylan.
My Lords, I make a move that this House takes note of the report of your Lordship's Built Environment Select Committee, the impact of environmental regulations on development. In doing so, I'd like to begin by offering a few words of thanks, first of all to the committee itself and to its members, both current members and former members, and I'm delighted to see so many of them here today contributing to this debate. I'd also like to thank the clerk of the committee, Kate Wallace, the researchers, Anna Gillingham, and latterly Andrea Ninomiya, our administrator, Hardia Garwell, and in particular our specialist advisor, Kelvin MacDonald, both for his academic insights and for his experience both as a planner and as a former planning inspector. Could I also take this opportunity, my Lords, to congratulate my noble friend, Lord Banner, on what I am sure is going to be a very welcome maiden speech that will follow shortly in the course of this debate. The time available for this debate is cruelly short, given the significance of the topic. So I've broken my thoughts down into three broad areas. The first is what is the general problem. The second is to illustrate it with some particular problems. And then the final point, if I get to it in time, is to ask whether there needs to be a problem at all, because really perhaps there doesn't. The general problem is that the government has ambitions both for building a certain number of houses. It has housing targets, which are well publicised. It also has ambitions for the environment, to leave it in a better state than it was previous generations had it. And the evidence found by the committee, the starting evidence for the committee, is that neither of these ambitions is likely to be met. In fact, we found very few people who thought the government would hit their housing targets, and we had it authoritatively from various senior figures at some government agencies that they were not going to meet their environmental targets either. And even worse than not meeting them is the fact that they appear to be operating in antagonism with each other, so that rather than cross-departmental working to achieve both, we appear to have two sets of targets working against each other the whole time. And in that context, it's worth saying that the environmental targets tend on the whole to win. And part of the reason for that is the legal background. The legal background to the environmental targets is European Union law, which we have inherited, particularly the habitats regulations. They are fundamentally coercive. They require things to happen or prohibit things to happen, on the one hand. And on the other hand, housing is, of course, driven fundamentally by the Town and Country Planning Act regime, which is essentially a permissive regime. Having planning permission doesn't oblige you to build anything. And it is, of course, based on domestic law. There's no European Union background to it in particular. And so, as a result of that, we have these constant battles going on that shouldn't really be necessary and do arise in part from conflicting legal systems. If I turn to the particular problems that the report addresses, the most prominent and the one most deserving of time, of course, is the one that's summarised in the expression nutrient neutrality. This dates back to a judgment of the European Court of Justice delivered in 2018, I believe, and it related to Dutch farmers. The Netherlands is a very intensely farmed place. For a small country, it produces an awful lot of food. And a lot of the pollution from that runs off into rivers, and various parties went to the European Court of Justice and said that this must stop. And the European Court of Justice agreed, and of course the Dutch government then completely kiboshed itself by putting in place a draconian plan for closing down farms, buying them up and closing them down, which has resulted in a sort of revolution in domestic Dutch politics. That's not the key matter of interest to us. The key matter of interest to us is that Natural England, an unaccountable agency that exists under statute in the UK, decided that that judgment applied at least to England as well. We're speaking predominantly of England in this debate, incidentally, as noble lords will be aware. That judgment applied to England as well, and they were backed up in this, I understand, although of course I haven't seen it, by legal advice from DEFRA. And as a result of that, they started to issue advice in relation to applications for residential planning permission, which effectively banned them from taking place because they would add pollutants to nearby watercourses without any mitigation. Now, it's not possible for Natural England actually to ban or nullify a planning permission. It does so by way of advice, but nonetheless, this is very potent advice because local planning authorities, first of all, live in constant terror of having a judicial review proceedings brought against them. And secondly, it must be said, my lords, that there are many local authorities who are delighted to be told that they can't build anything in their area, and this is a further problem that we have with our housing market. In fact, of course, we all know that the pollution that exists in our watercourses comes predominantly from sewage overspills and from agricultural practices. These agricultural practices are licensed by the Environment Agency, another player in this complex ecology of quangos running round causing confusion in every direction. But Natural England has no purchase on that. It does have purchase on applications for planning permission. So the whole burden is being put on the housing market, which in fact belongs elsewhere. And this is causing now that 14% of England's land area is now effectively under a ban for residential development at a time when we need more housing. Biodiversity net gain offers a contrasting story. What was notable about the nutrient neutrality is that it arrived out of the blue, as court judgments tend to, and so those who in the development world had no chance to prepare or plan for it. In the case of biodiversity net gain, there was discussion, there was consultation, and the larger house builders have incorporated it effectively into what they are doing. But the smaller house builders, for whom the committee has a great concern, have not managed to do that. And I'll just remind noble lords that 20 years ago, 40% of our homes were delivered by small and medium house builders. That is now down to 10%. We have moved towards a highly oligopolistic market for the provision of homes, and we have driven the small builders out, mainly through the costs of planning permission and regulation of this character. Because if you're building a small site, as smaller builders tend to, incorporating biodiversity net gain is extremely difficult. The larger house builders very often get permission to deliver it off-site. And here we come to another conflict with government policy, because they do that by buying up agricultural land and turning it fallow. And yet DEFRA tell us that they have an objective that we must continue to produce food for this country. At the moment, we produce 60% of our own food, that the DEFRA target is that that figure should not fall. And yet they are encouraging people to buy up agricultural land and turn it into nature reserves or whatever. And finally, there are perverse outcomes finally on biodiversity net gain, there are perverse outcomes in relation to derelict sites, brownfield sites. Everyone is agreed that building on a brownfield site is better than building on a greenfield site. And yet a brownfield site, if left derelict, actually becomes biodiverse quite quickly. The weeds come, the birds and the bees, the rodents arrive, and so on. So if you're going to take a brownfield site that's been left derelict for some time and build on it, the first thing you do is you contribute negative biodiversity net gain, because you're going to flatten it and destroy all of that. So what you have to supply to make up the difference and the additional 10% starts from a lower base, and it's a bigger challenge. We are perversely encouraging greenfield site development when we could be encouraging, when we say we want to encourage brownfield sites. Finally, under particular problems, I will come to the question of what's referred to as water neutrality, which is, I think, a slightly misleading expression because it suggests some parallel with nutrient neutrality. But really, it's almost better described as water sufficiency. We don't have enough water for many of the developments. It was announced in the Sunday Times while we were doing our report that the Secretary of State had said there were going to be 250,000 homes built in Cambridge. And it was pointed out that there was a planning application for 5,000 homes at the moment that was in Cambridge that was being held up because the Environment Agency claimed that there was insufficient water to supply them. Happily, when we quizzed the Minister of Housing on this, she was able to assure us that the Secretary of State had said no such thing and that it appeared on the front page of the Sunday Times entirely as a matter of speculation. So that was a great consolation to us to know that that particular article had no basis in the thinking of the Secretary of State, given that there is no water to service these 250,000 houses. But it does raise the question of why haven't we built any reservoirs for 40 years or whatever it is that might actually help and contribute to our housing target. I'm going to be very brief now. Is there a problem? I think there is a problem at the moment. Does there need to be a problem? Of course not. We are a reasonably well-off country. A reasonably well-off country can both build houses and improve the environment. It should not be that difficult. There should not be a conflict. But, my lords, it requires a vision, it requires a plan, and in the case of pollution in rivers, a plan that will take at least 30 or 40 years to deliver. It requires buy-in to that plan. It requires leadership and selling that vision, and then delivery with cross-party support. I think that can be done. And the current way of going around insisting that you're entitled to have what you want now, nobody's going to get what they want now. The only answer is going to be a long-term plan. Somebody has to take the lead. I look to my noble friend on the front bench to do that as she steps forward and explains how the government is going to resolve these problems for future generations, because it's unlikely she's going to resolve them for this generation, sadly. And if we've cast light on that and pointed a path, we feel we will have done something very valuable.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, it gives me great